California state prisons house nearly 130,000 inmates. Each year, these prisons release tens of thousands of offenders back into the community after serving their sentences. While incarcerated, offenders often participate in various rehabilitation programs with the hope they won't reoffend. Do these programs work? We'll ask an expert in criminal justice issues, Justin Gross, with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California.
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. A key goal of prison is rehabilitation, and if released, we want those folks not to recommit crimes at a later date. Recently, there's been a dramatic shift in policy away from the way we treat criminals, more on a focus on rehabilitation instead of a focus on punishment. The question is, what impact has this public policy shift had on those involved in the most serious crimes, felons? Has it made them more or less likely to reoffend? Our guest is Justin Gross with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, who recently authored a report that attempts to answer that very question. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here, thanks.
So, first, it's helpful to define what is recidivism. We hear that word a lot. How is it measured?
Yeah, recidivism is a broad swath of reoffending behavior. We define it in our study in 4 different ways to try to capture the umbrella term that's usually used. So we follow offenders from 2011 to 2015 and track them for 2 years after they're released from a period of incarceration or start a period of supervision, like probation.
Right.
And we measure it in terms of rearrest for any offense after being convicted of a prior offense, rearrest for a felony offense in particular, reconviction for any offense, or reconviction for a felony offense.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point. I want to underscore that because people might have missed what you were saying there, and that is there's a difference between rearrest and reconviction. Right? You could be arrested but found innocent or not found guilty. So that's and then we'll talk about more of that in a moment. But I want to make sure people understand the difference between rearrest and reconviction. They're different things.
Certainly.
So okay, historically, California, how's it done in recidivism rates compared to other states?
So historically, California's recidivism rates have been higher than some of its comparable neighbors, but we'll get into a little bit later how those comparisons are a little bit challenging to make apples-to-apples comparisons between. But historically, California in the decade leading up to 2011, when we passed a major criminal justice reform, about 2/3 of all offenders were returned to prison after having been released.
And some of those are because of parole violations. We'll talk about that.
That's true. There are multiple ways to return to prison.
Right. And by the way, there's another thing that I've learned as I'm reading this stuff is there's a difference between prison and jail. State prison, county jail.
Absolutely.
Yeah, people kind of mix those terms together sometimes. And I was looking at your report compared to New York, just to give you a kind of a juxtaposition.
Sure.
New York, 43%.
Correct.
Texas, 36%. Florida, 25%. So we had higher rates going into this.
That's true. Folks were returning to prison at higher rates than how those states typically define recidivism.
Right, and that changed, and we'll talk about it after 2011. So there were several major criminal justice reforms that occurred in the past decade. Can you describe the most consequential?
Let me talk about 2 there. So first, in 2011, there was what's now referred to as public safety realignment, where in response to the United States Supreme Court holding that California's prisons were overcrowded, the governor and the legislature acted to reduce the prison population, reduce overcrowding, without having to build more prisons, which would be...
And they were really, really overcrowded. It wasn't just a few people. It was like 50, 60, 70% more than they're supposed to have capacity.
That's true. If you want to put a number on it, the Supreme Court ordered California to reduce its prison population to 137.5% of rated capacity.
So still 37.5% above capacity.
That is true.
But they were way beyond that.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes. And so realignment, what it did was it caused this mass transfer, and I'm glad that you talked about state prison versus county jail, because it caused a mass realignment of supervision of offenders from state prison to county jail. And those folks who were ineligible to be realigned were those who had serious violent or sex-related criminal histories. And so what it did was it concentrated some of these more serious offenders in state prisons and then changed supervision status for a much broader swath of offenders to the county.
Yeah, and then the question also is, which is not necessarily something I want to get into in much detail, but county jails were not necessarily designed for this population, right? And so all of a sudden you're shifting all these people to county jails that really weren't ready for it in some ways. So that's another issue. Do want to ask you about, these reforms are not without controversy. I mean, people, their proponents, their opponents, proponents of these things, the three strikes group thought you'd be tough on crime versus this was a different approach to crime. What have been some of the arguments?
The second reform that really caused a significant amount of controversy came after realignment, 2014, with Proposition 47, which reclassified some property and drug offenses from felonies to misdemeanors.
The three nons, right? Was non-violent, non-serious, non-sexual.
Well, so that again was realignment. Those were the folks who were able to be realigned from state prison to county jail. Prop 47 targeted just a few lower-level drug and property offenses and changed their classification from felonies to misdemeanors. And the controversy that you speak of, so proponents argued that incarceration is costly and doesn't really do much to improve rehabilitation outcomes. And they point to the high recidivism rates or return to prison rates that you touched on earlier to say that it's not really working and the taxpayers aren't getting their money's worth. Opponents argue that reducing incarceration spells and shortening the sentences takes away a key deterrent for offenders and also possibly threatens public safety.
Okay, well, measuring recidivism is a little more complicated than you might think. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Justin Gross with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California about a report recently he authored entitled Recidivism of Felony Offenders in California. So you state in your report that, quote, recidivism is notoriously hard to measure, unquote. Why?
There's a couple reasons, but let me talk about the main one that we talk about in the report, which is that recidivism is a proxy for reoffending behavior, and it tends to be a little bit over-inclusive and under-inclusive, where it's over-inclusive in the sense that past research has shown that ex-offenders under more stringent supervision might commit minor technical violations that are then detected more easily.
Right, yeah, because they're being watched.
Exactly, right. And as a result, that ends up showing up as recidivism where it might not have ordinarily. The other thing is a little bit easier to imagine where it's under-inclusive, where recidivism can only be detected if law enforcement in some way detects that reoffending behavior. So you can imagine that someone could be released from a period of incarceration, go on to reoffend, but then there's no arrest, and so we don't observe it in the data.
Right. So yeah, it all depends on the numbers, what's being collected. So you also state in your report that it's now difficult, keyword is now, to compare California's recidivism rates with those of other states. Why?
There's also a couple of reasons for that. On the one hand, we've been talking about multiple measures of recidivism, and so it's always been challenging because certain states might define recidivism differently, where, for instance, prior to realignment, California defined recidivism as return to prison rate, where since most folks were being supervised by the state prisons, they would leave state prisons, and if they reoffended, they would come back to state prison. But after realignment, that definition needed to change because most offenders were no longer being supervised by state prison. So now California uses the 3-year reconviction rate for offenses to measure recidivism.
Right. And can you give us an overview on felony offenders who were released? How many were being released from prison or jail? How many were on probation? Get an idea of that?
In our data, so we have data from 12 of the state's counties that comprise 300,000 felony offenders who were released between October 2011 and October 2015.
Pretty good sample size.
Yeah, it makes up about 60%. Those 12 counties account for 60% of California's offender population. And so among those, what we saw were that 34% were released from a period of being sentenced to jail followed by probation. About a third were sentenced to prison. About a quarter came from a period of only probation, and about 1 in 10 served just a period of jail with no probation tail.
Kind of give you an idea what the felony population looks like. So you mentioned that releases varied across different sentencing groups. Can you explain that?
Yes. What we saw was that as time moves further away from public safety realignment in 2011, there's a gradual decrease in the number of releases from state prison, which makes sense because
Right, the population is smaller.
Exactly. Fewer offenders are going to prison, fewer offenders are coming out. And then we also saw a gradual increase in the number of offenders being sentenced to jail with no probation because that was a creation of realignment known as straight sentencing, where you could be sentenced to jail with no probation tail.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what the straight sentencing was about. Thank you for clarifying that in advance of my asking the question. So let's talk about demographics and criminal histories. Do you see any patterns among felony offenders?
Yeah, in the 300,000 offenders that are in our data, the average age was 34 years old. 84%, so the vast majority
And by the
were
way,
male.
80% are male, but I want to get back to that number 34. I noticed
Sure.
that in your report. But you also said the first conviction was at 24.
That is true.
Yeah.
And the average number of prior arrests was 15.
Wow.
So, yeah, so
That's a frequent flyer, as it were.
That's one way to refer to them.
Right.
Yeah. Other things that we saw along racial ethnic lines, a quarter of them were African American, a little less than a third were white, and 4 in 10 were Latino.
So that doesn't match up necessarily with the general population, right? Some of those statistics are higher than the general population.
That's true. Historically, what we see in California's prisons and jails is that African Americans tend to be overrepresented, Latinos tend to be somewhat overrepresented, and whites tend to be underrepresented relative to their numbers in the population. In terms of criminal histories, which you also asked about 1 in 5 of these offenders were serving an offense for an offense against another person.
Which could be a violent offense.
A violent or nonviolent.
Right,
certain
right.
nonviolent
But
offenses.
it could be a violent, yeah.
Yes, absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely. And about a third were for a drug offense, and a little more than a quarter were for a property offense.
Property offense, yeah, like burglary, things of that nature.
Exactly.
So, okay, how do those characteristics change over time as the criminal justice reforms were implemented?
What we saw over time is that as we get further away from realignment, the population tends to get a little bit older. The population is a little bit more likely to be male. The population is a little bit less likely to be white. And post Prop 47, as we talked about before, which changed certain drug offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, the likelihood that someone was serving a sentence for a drug offense decreased.
Okay. Well, up next, how often are ex-felons rearrested after they're released, and how often do those arrests lead to new convictions? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Justin Gross, an expert in the criminal justice system with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, about recidivism rates for ex-felons after release. So, what types of crimes are being committed by ex-felons?
Well, so we tracked reoffending behavior over time, over the period of 4 years, October 2011 to October 2015, and followed reoffense behavior for a period of 2 years after they were released from incarceration.
And we're talking about rearrest as well as reconviction.
That's right. So just to recap, we measure recidivism along 4 lines: rearrest for any offense, rearrest for felony offenses, reconviction. So
I was giving a summary, but yes, in more detail, yeah, in terms of arrest rates for felons overall, et cetera.
Exactly, yeah. Reconviction and then reconviction for a felony offense. And what we found overall is that rearrests declined during this period by 3%, which we would say is a relatively small decrease, but a significant one. The felony rearrest rate for offenders declined by 5% during the period. The reconviction rate declined by 15%, so a larger amount, and the felony reconviction rate declined by 27%, which is quite substantial.
Yeah, and I was looking at the thing, it says if I understand this correctly, the overall rearrest rate for crimes against persons, which could include violent crimes, increased by 5%. And felony rearrest rate also rose by 7%. And I'm just wondering, for those folks who are saying, we're getting soft on crime, do these statistics prove that removing the threat of prison, kind of de-emphasizing punishment, is emboldening criminals?
Not necessarily. That is a hypothesis, a change in criminal behavior in response to these criminal justice reforms. That is an interpretation of the data, but we can't actually say that for sure. It's also important to contextualize that finding a little bit and say that reconvictions for offenses against persons, which, as you said, includes violent offenses, but also includes nonviolent offenses such as stalking or harassment. Reconvictions stayed mostly flat during this period. The other thing, just to contextualize it a little bit more for the audience, is that there was an increase, that 5% increase in rearrests for offenses against persons represented only a 1 percentage point increase in rearrest rates from 19% to 20%. So 5% is actually a relatively small increase.
Right, yeah, 1% overall. So let me ask you this, recidivism rates when it comes to property crimes, what did you find there?
For property crimes, what we found is that there was significant fluctuation where rates increased a little bit as we got further away from realignment, but then fell as we got further away from realignment and then declined after Prop 47. Ultimately, what we found is that the overall rearrest rate for property offenses stayed about the same over the period of the entirety of the data, and that we observed a small decline in felony rearrest rates for property offenses by about 4%. So 4% lower start to finish.
A little bit lower.
And then reconvictions followed about the same pattern. Overall reconvictions for property offenses stayed about the
So I
same.
think some people were worried that, that maybe people with drug offenses or whatever are going to go out and cause property crimes. But that's not, the data's not really showing that.
Not in terms of property offenses. No,
Okay.
not when we look over the full course of those 4 years of our data.
Well, let's talk about drug offenses. What are the recidivism rates for drug offenses?
Drug offenses, we saw significant changes following particularly Proposition 47. So over the full period of the data, and most of these changes we think are partially attributable at least to Proposition 47, which again took misdemeanor drug offenses took felony drug offenses and reclassified them as misdemeanor drug offenses. So you had fewer folks serving longer sentences for these drug offenses. So what we saw is that rearrest rates for drug offenses declined by 9% during the data. So relatively large amount.
Okay.
But even more so for felony rearrest for drug offenses, they fell by 44%.
Wow, that's a big number.
Large number,
That's a very large number.
but not quite as large as the felony reconviction rate for drug offenses, which fell by 69%. Wow. But again, we would expect to see this just because offenses that folks were being arrested for are no longer felonies.
Right, they're reclassifying.
Instead, they're misdemeanors.
Yeah,
exactly.
wow, but those are tremendous drops. So what about offenses like DUI and possession of a weapon, those recidivism rates in that area?
This was a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of what we saw, where the rearrest rate for these other offenses, like you said, DUIs or possession of a weapon, they declined by 8% start to finish. But the felony rearrest rate increased slightly by 9%. And then the overall reconviction rate for these offenses rose by 6%, and the felony reconviction rate increased by 9%.
Okay, so a bit of a mixed bag.
Excuse me, 13%.
A mixed bag is basically what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. So what conclusions can you draw from all these findings?
It's always a little bit difficult to get to the bottom of what's causing these changes in reoffending behavior. What we can say for sure is that these criminal justice reforms happened, and then we did not see substantial increases in reoffending
Which was
behavior.
a concern of a lot of people.
Absolutely, yeah. Opponents were concerned, perhaps fairly, that these criminal justice reforms, and as you said, realigning folks from state prison supervision to county jail and probation supervision, where the counties were initially unused to supervising certain types of offenders, people were concerned as to what that would do to the public safety, but we did not see substantial increases in reoffending behavior.
Yeah, it seems like they're working it out as they go along. Well, up next, some recommendations on how we can reduce recidivism even more. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Justin Gross, an expert in recidivism with the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, about recidivism rates among ex-felons who've been released since California passed a series of criminal justice reforms over the last decade. In short, has California's attempt at criminal justice reform increased or decreased recidivism among ex-felons? So, felons have been released and then reconvicted. Did you observe any patterns based if they served their sentences in prison, state prison, or locally in a county jail or probation?
What we found was pretty interesting, where so we were able to compare the outcomes for folks being released from prison to folks being released from a period of just jail supervision, jail and probation, or probation only. And what we found is that the group sentenced to jail only had lower rearrest and reconviction rates than the group sentenced to prison. What we found for the probation and jail and probation groups, a little bit more of a mixed bag. In both cases, we found higher rates of rearrest, but lower rates of both reconviction and felony reconviction.
So they're being watched, but maybe not convicted. So that's easier to arrest them, but maybe not convict them.
Exactly. It ties back to what we were talking about with recidivism sometimes being over-inclusive, where their behavior, it's being detected, but then ultimately either the DA decides not to file charges, or in something in the law enforcement, it does not rise to the level of
and that's a really good point, because it depends a lot on the DA's, their discretion about whether or not they want to prosecute certain crimes and go after certain people. And so that impacts recidivism rates from location to location.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this. What kinds of offenses were these people later convicted of?
Right. So we broke down the specific types of offenses that if a person did reoffend, did recidivate, what type of offense they were most likely to have reoffended with. So if a person reoffended and it was for an offense against a person, so a violent offense, an offense against a person, they were most likely to have come from the prison or jail group. Compared to if a person reoffended and it was for a property offense, they were most likely to have come from the jail group in particular, more so than any of the other groups. And then lastly, if it was for a drug offense, it was most likely that the person was being supervised by probation only.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, it sounds like the prison population is a little bit, frankly, hardcore, and more serious crimes, and that's where those folks are coming from. So, were there any trends you noticed by the type of offense? I mean, was there an increase and decrease, for example, in drug and property crimes?
Yeah, overall, we found that...
It declined a little bit, didn't it?
Overall, we found that offenses against persons increased a little bit, that reconvictions for offenses for property offenses decreased slightly during the period, and then rearrests and reconvictions for drug offenses during the period declined substantially.
Okay, so overall, was there getting right down to brass tacks here, was there an increase or decrease in rearrest rates first?
Overall, we found a small decrease, about 3%, in rearrest rates overall. We found a somewhat larger, about 9%, in terms of rearrest for felonies in particular. And then we found larger decreases in reconvictions, both for overall offenses and felony offenses.
So that's some good news. There's a decline there. So that seems to be good news. So why are those rates then, are they declining? Does this prove that California's attempt at criminal justice reform might actually be working?
It depends on what you think the goal of criminal justice reform was. So in the beginning of this, we talked about how the state was motivated by the Supreme Court decision to uncrowd the prisons and reduce overcrowding.
And it was also a budget issue too, right? Because
exactly.
It was expensive to house these folks, and we're going through a recession. The state needed money, and how expensive is it approximately to house someone in state prison?
I believe the Legislative Analyst's Office, when they last estimated it, put it somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's a lot of money when you think about that.
It is quite expensive. And so if that was the goal, to reduce overcrowding in prisons without substantially raising incarceration costs, while also not threatening public safety, it seems like the reforms have been a success, because as we talked about, the reforms have occurred and we haven't seen substantial increases in reoffending behavior.
No big spec. So let me ask you this, kind of from a different perspective. Is there any evidence to show that more severe sanctions or higher criminal penalties resulted in better or lower recidivism rates?
Not exactly. Other research, and our research was consistent with this, shows that there's not a strong statistical link between reoffending behavior and the severity or length of a sentence. And we sort of got into that when we talked about comparing the groups to the outcomes with the prison group, where offenders sentenced to prison in our data, they were supervised for an average of 980 days, so nearly 3 years. And compare that to the group that was supervised in jail. They were supervised for an average of 256 days. Those sentenced to jail and probation, 71 days. And like we talked about, those offenders sentenced to jail and probation actually had lower reconviction outcomes.
That is really interesting. To repeat that again, they had lower outcomes than
they overall had, so the probation and jail and probation group had higher rearrest but lower reconviction outcomes.
Which is, I mean, reconviction is the kind of seemed to be the important one.
Sure, and like we've talked about, there's a number of factors, so we can't say for sure that this is a change in offending behavior, but it is possible that as we got further away from realignment, the resources accruing to counties allowed them to better supervise their offenders.
Well, that's a lot of information you gave us, Justin. I appreciate your being with us, Justin Gross with the Public Policy Institute of California. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. I'm Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.